They called it the fork-tailed devil. December 27, 1942. The twin-boomed silhouette appeared from the sun at 18,000 feet, diving at speeds no Japanese pilot had ever seen. 3 Mitsubishi Zeros turned to intercept, confident in their legendary maneuverability. Within seconds, the American fighter accelerated past 450 miles per hour and vanished into the distance, untouchable. The Zero pilots could only watch, helpless, as everything they'd learned about aerial combat became obsolete. This is the story of how the Lockheed P-38 Lightning revolutionized warfare in the Pacific, and the farm boy from Wisconsin who became its deadliest master. Port Moresby, New Guinea. Morning sun cast hard shadows across Loki Airfield's steel matting. Ground crews hauled camouflage netting from 12 Lockheed P-38F Lightnings, their distinctive twin tails gleaming in tropical dawn light. Captain Thomas Lynch checked fuel levels and signaled his 39th Fighter Squadron pilots. Among them stood 2nd Lieutenant Richard Bong, temporarily attached from the 49th Fighter Group's 9th Squadron, still awaiting their own P-38 deliveries. The Wisconsin farm boy who'd learned flying through civilian pilot training now sat in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter in the Pacific Theater. He didn't yet know this morning would launch him toward 40 confirmed victories and the American ace record. Intelligence from coast watchers crackled through operations, major Japanese air raid developing over Guinea. Estimated 40 aircraft with fighter escort. Time to intercept, 30 minutes. For 13 months, Imperial Japanese Navy pilots had dominated Pacific skies. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 possessed a turning radius of 950 feet, could climb to 6,000 feet in 7 minutes 27 seconds, and reached maximum speeds of 331 miles per hour. These specifications had translated into overwhelming victories from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. American pilots in their Bell P-39 Airacobras and Curtiss P-40 Warhawks learned through blood that engaging a Zero in turning combat meant almost certain death. The Zero's legendary agility had become the nightmare haunting every Allied fighter pilot. But the P-38 Lightning represented revolutionary philosophy. Twin Allison V-1710 engines, each producing 1,150 horsepower, mounted in distinctive booms flanking a central nacelle. Turbo-superchargers maintained full power at altitudes where normally aspirated engines gasped for oxygen. Maximum speed of 414 miles per hour. Service ceiling of 44,000 feet. And concentrated in the nose, where convergence problems couldn't affect accuracy, 120mm Hispano cannon and 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns. All firing straight ahead with devastating precision. Richard Bong had studied these specifications at Hamilton Field, California. He understood the Lightning's advantage lay not in turning with Zeros but in refusing the turning fight entirely. Speed, altitude, firepower. Strike from above, dive through enemy formations, climb back to altitude using energy the enemy couldn't match. These tactics demanded discipline, patience, complete rejection of traditional dogfighting instincts. Most pilots struggled to abandon their training. Bong embraced it. The approaching Japanese formation flew standard escort patterns. Veterans from Tainan Air Group piloted their Zeros with casual confidence, protecting Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers targeting Allied positions at Guinea. These pilots had swept across the Pacific rarely meeting serious opposition. American fighters typically struggled above 15,000 feet, their inferior climb rates making them predictable targets. The morning's mission appeared routine. Escort bombers to target, suppress any Allied fighter opposition, return to base. Japanese intelligence had noted occasional twin-boomed aircraft in recent weeks but classified them as reconnaissance planes or light bombers. The possibility that Americans had developed a fighter specifically engineered to negate the Zero's advantages hadn't occurred to Japanese tacticians. That miscalculation would prove catastrophic. At 18,000 feet, the P-38 formation held every advantage. Captain Lynch spotted the Japanese formation below and pushed his Lightning into a diving attack. Airspeed built rapidly, 350 miles per hour, 380, 400, then exceeding 420 as the twin Allison engines screamed. Behind him, Bong and other pilots selected targets, watching the Japanese formation grow larger in their gunsights. The concentrated firepower from nose-mounted weapons allowed engagement at ranges exceeding 400 yards, well beyond effective range of the Zeros' lighter armament. Lynch's guns opened fire first. The impact was devastating. A Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar simply disintegrated under the hammer of 20mm cannon shells and .50 caliber bullets. Pieces of wing and fuselage tumbled earthward trailing smoke. As Lynch pulled up from his attack, climbing effortlessly back to altitude, Zero pilots attempted to follow. Warning bells sounded in their cockpits as airspeed approached 400 miles per hour. Their aircraft began shuddering violently, approaching structural limits Japanese designers had never anticipated needing to exceed. The Americans disappeared upward while Zero pilots could only break off pursuit or risk their aircraft breaking apart. Richard Bong spotted a Zero attempting to climb toward Captain Lynch's Lightning. Rolling his P-38 into deflection position, Bong led the target, compensating for the Zero's movement. His finger pressed the trigger. Tracers arced across the sky and converged on the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter exploded in flames and spun earthward. Bong's first combat kill. As he pulled up from the attack, 3 more Zeros converged on his position, their pilots certain they could trap the American fighter. Bong's response shocked them. Instead of turning to engage, he pushed both throttles to maximum power and dove away. The Lightning accelerated past 430 miles per hour, then 450, the twin engines roaring at full emergency power. The Japanese pilots watched in disbelief as the twin-boomed fighter simply disappeared into the distance, accelerating to speeds their Zeros couldn't approach without catastrophic structural failure. They'd never encountered anything like it. Pulling out of his dive just above jungle canopy, Bong spotted an Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber recovering from its attack run, slow and vulnerable at low altitude. A short burst from 100 yards sent it crashing into the jungle in a fireball. Bong's second victory, scored less than 10 minutes after his first. He climbed back to altitude, untouchable, and rejoined his squadron. The entire engagement lasted 9 minutes. The 39th Fighter Squadron claimed 12 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Not a single P-38 was damaged. The American pilots landed at Port Moresby, refueled, rearmed, and prepared for afternoon missions. The Japanese pilots who survived returned to Rabaul base with shocking reports that would send intelligence officers scrambling. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Okumura sat in the operations briefing room at Rabaul, reading after-action reports from pilots who'd encountered the twin-boomed aircraft. The descriptions seemed impossible. Aircraft possessing speed exceeding 450 miles per hour in dive. Engaged from ranges beyond our effective firing distance. Could not pursue when they disengaged. Climbed to altitudes we could not reach. Okumura had flown Zeros since the China campaign, accumulating 11 confirmed victories. He'd swept over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. No American fighter had ever escaped him. But these reports described something fundamentally different. An aircraft that didn't fight like a fighter but like a raptor, striking from unreachable altitude and escaping before defenders could respond. The comfortable world of horizontal maneuvering combat where Japanese pilots excelled had suddenly become a vertical battlefield where altitude and speed determined survival. This transformation sent shockwaves through Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters. Intelligence officers scrambled to reassess the P-38's capabilities. The twin-engine configuration had led them to categorize it as a heavy fighter unsuitable for air-to-air combat, something comparable to their own twin-engine Kawasaki Ki-45 escort fighter. They hadn't anticipated that American engineers had created something entirely new, a fighter achieving superiority through vertical energy tactics rather than horizontal agility. The technical revolution became increasingly clear through subsequent encounters. The Lightning's turbo-superchargers maintained full power at altitudes where normally aspirated Japanese engines lost 50% of their output. Its diving speed approached the sound barrier faster than any Japanese aircraft could follow without structural failure. Its ability to convert speed into altitude meant P-38 pilots could regain their perch above enemy formations within seconds of an attack, ready to strike again. January 7, 1943. 9 P-38s escorting bombers over La encountered approximately 20 Japanese fighters. Traditional doctrine suggested the outnumbered Americans adopt defensive positions. Instead, the Lightnings climbed to 25,000 feet and initiated diving attacks from positions the Japanese couldn't reach. Richard Bong, now flying regularly with the 39th Squadron while his unit awaited P-38 deliveries, demonstrated the Lightning's lethal efficiency. Diving from altitude, he destroyed a Ki-43 Oscar with a deflection shot at 300 yards, his gunnery skill evident in the brief burst that found its mark. As Japanese fighters attempted to climb toward him, Bong executed a chandelle maneuver, converting his speed into altitude and emerging at 20,000 feet, completely outside the enemy engagement envelope. From this perch, untouchable and patient, he selected another target and repeated the process. The geometry of vertical combat was something Japanese pilots had never encountered. Against the P-38, their traditional tactics were useless. By the time a Zero pilot maneuvered into theoretical firing position, the Lightning was already a mile away and climbing through altitude bands the Japanese fighter couldn't reach without stalling. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the tactical disadvantage. Japanese pilots who'd enjoyed qualitative superiority since the war's beginning found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The stress of constantly scanning above, knowing death could plummet from altitudes they couldn't reach or prevent, eroded morale catastrophically. Some pilots developed combat fatigue symptoms previously unknown in Japanese military culture. Letters home, captured after island battles, revealed deep demoralization. One pilot wrote of nightmares about twin-boomed shadows diving from the sun, always out of reach, always untouchable. Another requested transfer to ground combat units rather than face the Lightnings again. The confident Japanese naval aviators who'd swept across the Pacific were learning fear. By February 1943, P-38 presence in the Southwest Pacific expanded rapidly. The 9th Fighter Squadron finally received their Lightnings. The 80th Fighter Squadron transitioned from P-39s to P-38s. The 475th Fighter Group, an all-Lightning unit, formed in Australia. Each new squadron studied combat reports from pilots like Lynch and Bong, refining tactics maximizing the P-38's advantages. Training programs instituted by squadron commanders emphasized altitude discipline above everything. Altitude is life insurance, became the mantra. Speed is life. Pilots learned to resist instinct to turn with enemy fighters, instead maintaining high velocity and employing vertical maneuvers. The high-speed yo-yo allowed a P-38 to convert excess speed into altitude while reversing direction. The barrel roll attack used the Lightning's roll rate to maintain guns on target while preserving momentum. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were survival techniques proven in Pacific skies. Japanese attempts to counter these tactics proved largely ineffective. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, with its liquid-cooled engine and heavier armament, was designed specifically to engage high-altitude American bombers. But even the Tony couldn't match P-38 performance above 20,000 feet. The Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki emphasized speed and climb rate over maneuverability but still fell short of Lightning capabilities. Intelligence reports from Japanese units revealed growing desperation. Pilots were instructed to avoid combat with P-38s unless possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and advantageous position. Even then, engagement was discouraged above 15,000 feet where the Lightning's performance advantage became insurmountable. Some units attempted to lure P-38s into low-altitude turning fights, but American pilots had learned discipline. They refused engagement on unfavorable terms. The initiative belonged entirely to the Lightning pilots. They chose when and where to fight. The Japanese could only react. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 demonstrated P-38 strategic impact. Lightnings flew top cover for Allied bombers attacking a major Japanese convoy reinforcing New Guinea. When Zero escorts rose to intercept, the P-38s executed perfect vertical tactics, destroying multiple Japanese fighters while preventing effective defense of the convoy below. 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers were sunk, dealing a crushing blow to Japanese reinforcement efforts. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. The convoy's destruction demonstrated that Japanese forces in New Guinea could no longer be resupplied by sea in daylight. The P-38 had achieved not just tactical superiority but strategic dominance. Among the Lightning pilots establishing supremacy over the Solomons, several names became legendary. Captain Thomas Lynch refined vertical tactics to lethal art, eventually scoring 20 victories before his death in March 1944. Lieutenant Richard Bong continued his remarkable streak, demonstrating uncanny ability to position his P-38 for perfect deflection shots that required minimal ammunition expenditure. April 18, 1943. American codebreakers intercepted Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's travel itinerary for an inspection tour of Solomon Islands bases. The architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. The mission to intercept him would require a 435-mile overwater flight from Guadalcanal, precise navigation without landmarks, and exact timing to arrive at the intercept point when Yamamoto's aircraft passed through. Only the P-38 possessed the range, speed, and navigation equipment for such a mission. Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, led 16 Lightnings on the longest fighter intercept mission of the war. Mitchell bore ultimate responsibility. If his navigation was off by 2 minutes, Yamamoto's Betty bomber would pass through empty sky. If weather obscured visual identification, the entire mission would fail. If Zero escort spotted the P-38s 30 seconds earlier, American fighters might be forced into disadvantageous combat before reaching their target. The P-38s launched at dawn, flying at wave-top height to avoid Japanese radar detection. Radio silence throughout. Mitchell navigated by dead reckoning for over 2 hours across featureless ocean, calculating wind drift and fuel consumption while maintaining formation integrity. Every pilot understood the stakes. This wasn't just another intercept. They were executing an assassination, the targeted killing of an enemy military commander based on intelligence intercepts. At 0934 hours, exactly as planned, Mitchell's formation arrived at the intercept point. And there, precisely on schedule, appeared 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers with 6 Zero escorts. Mitchell's navigation had been perfect. The attack flight, led by Captain Thomas Lanford Jr. and Lieutenant Rex Barber, rolled into their assault as the top cover engaged Japanese escorts. Barber's concentrated fire walked up the Betty's fuselage. Smoke erupted from the wing root. The bomber's nose dropped, rolled inverted, and disappeared into jungle canopy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto perished in the crash. The 16 P-38s had flown 870 miles round-trip to execute the most audacious assassination in aviation history. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese military leadership immediately. If American fighters could reach across hundreds of miles of ocean with such precision, no one was safe. Following Yamamoto's death, Japanese fighter tactics underwent desperate revision. Pilots received instructions to attack P-38s only when possessing altitude advantage, numerical superiority of at least 3-1, and surprise. Even then, engagement was to be brief with immediate disengagement if initial attack failed. These defensive tactics represented complete reversal from the aggressive spirit characterizing Japanese fighter doctrine. The introduction of new Japanese aircraft failed to restore balance. The Kawasaki Ki-84 Frank, appearing late 1943, could match P-38 speed at medium altitudes but couldn't compete above 25,000 feet. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden emphasized climb rate and high-altitude performance but sacrificed range and maneuverability. Neither appeared in sufficient numbers to challenge American air superiority. By November 1943, the transformation was complete. Japanese daylight operations over the Solomons had virtually ceased. Richard Bong's combat technique evolved to near perfection through 1943 and into 1944. He would climb to 30,000 feet, beyond reach of any Japanese fighter, then select targets carefully. His attacks were swift, precise, lethal. Bong averaged less than 100 rounds fired per victory, demonstrating remarkable gunnery skill when typical pilots expended 500 rounds per kill. In one engagement over Hollandia, Bong shot down 3 Japanese fighters in less than 5 minutes using perfect vertical tactics that left opponents unable to respond. By April 1944, he'd surpassed Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. His eventual total of 40 confirmed victories, all scored in P-38s, represented not just personal skill but systematic superiority. His victims included veteran Japanese aces who simply couldn't counter the Lightning's performance advantages. Each victory reinforced the lesson: technology properly employed could overcome experience and individual skill. August 1943 brought a new name to the Lightning ace roster. Lieutenant Thomas McGuire, assigned to the newly formed 475th Fighter Group's 431st Fighter Squadron, scored his first victories on August 18 over Wewak. Flying top cover for bombers, McGuire's flight encountered approximately 20 Japanese fighters. In his first combat engagement, McGuire shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars and 1 Ki-61 Tony, demonstrating natural gunnery talent and tactical discipline. He became an ace just 2 days later, adding 2 more victories on August 21. McGuire's combat philosophy emphasized aggressive vertical tactics and precise gunnery. He would eventually author a manual titled Combat Tactics in the Southwest Pacific Area that became required reading throughout 5th Air Force. His techniques included the McGuire roll, a high-speed barrel roll maintaining offensive position while preserving momentum, and the vertical reverse, using the P-38's climb capability to reverse positions with pursuing enemies. His eventual 38 victories, scored between August 1943 and January 1945, demonstrated lethal efficiency of properly executed tactics taught systematically across units. The statistics told a stark story. Japanese fighter units in the Solomons and New Guinea suffered catastrophic losses. The 251st Air Group began 1943 with 80 pilots. By year's end, only 10 original members survived. The 204th Air Group lost 70% of its pilots in 6 months. The 582nd Air Group was withdrawn from combat entirely after losing 80% of its aircraft in 4 months of operations against P-38 equipped American units. American losses, while not insignificant, remained sustainable. P-38 squadrons typically achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better. More importantly, American pilots shot down over friendly territory were often rescued and returned to combat. Japanese pilots who went down over water usually drowned. American aircraft damaged in combat were repaired and returned to service. Japanese aircraft with similar damage were often abandoned due to lack of spare parts. The arithmetic of attrition warfare had become inexorable. The industrial disparity continued widening. By December 1943, Lockheed had delivered over 2,000 P-38s to combat theaters. Monthly production exceeded 400 aircraft. Japanese production of all fighter types barely reached 500 per month, and many were retained in home islands for defense. Training standards diverged even further. American P-38 pilots arriving late 1943 had extensive training in vertical tactics, instrument flying, and long-range navigation. Many practiced combat maneuvers against captured Japanese aircraft, understanding exactly their opponent's capabilities and limitations. Japanese replacement pilots, rushed through programs shortened from 2 years to 6 months, arrived with minimal combat preparation and no experience against P-38s. The human dimension of this transformation cannot be overlooked. Japanese pilots who'd entered the war as elite warriors confident in their superiority found themselves helpless against an enemy they couldn't reach or catch. The Philippines campaign of late 1944 demonstrated P-38 matured capabilities. Lightning squadrons achieved air superiority over Leyte within days of invasion. Japanese attempts to reinforce by air resulted in catastrophic losses. On November 2, 1944, P-38s of the 49th Fighter Group destroyed 26 Japanese aircraft without loss. Such one-sided victories had become routine. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese bases was enabled by P-38 escort. B-24 Liberators could reach targets throughout the Southwest Pacific knowing Lightning escorts would protect them. Japanese interceptors, unable to reach bomber altitudes when P-38s were present, were reduced to ineffective attacks on the margins. Air bases, fuel depots, supply centers were systematically destroyed. By early 1945, Japanese air power in the Southwest Pacific had effectively ceased to exist. The few remaining experienced pilots had been withdrawn to defend home islands. Replacement pilots with minimal training and obsolete aircraft were sacrificed in futile defensive actions. Between December 1942 and January 1945, P-38 units in the Southwest Pacific claimed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. American P-38 losses to enemy action totaled fewer than 250 aircraft. The kill ratio exceeded 7-1, unprecedented in aerial warfare. Beyond statistics, the P-38's impact was transformational. It proved technological superiority, properly employed, could overcome numerical disadvantage and enemy experience. It demonstrated air superiority wasn't about dogfighting but controlling engagement parameters. It showed industrial capacity and training systems were as important as courage and skill. The influence extended beyond World War II. The P-38's success influenced post-war fighter development worldwide. Vertical maneuvering became fundamental to jet-age combat. The importance of altitude and speed over turning ability shaped designs from the F-86 Sabre to modern fifth-generation fighters. Richard Bong's 40 victories stood as the American record for aerial combat. Thomas McGuire's 38 victories and tactical innovations influenced fighter doctrine for generations. Dozens of other P-38 aces demonstrated that with proper equipment and training, American pilots could dominate any aerial battlefield. The Japanese pilots who faced the Lightning showed remarkable courage in impossible circumstances. Flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming technological superiority, they continued fighting long after hope of victory had vanished. Veterans on both sides remembered the Lightning with mixture of awe and respect. American pilots praised its versatility, reliability, overwhelming performance advantages. Japanese pilots recalled it as the aircraft that ended their dominance, the twin-boomed devil that could not be caught or escaped. In post-war interviews decades later, Japanese veterans described the helplessness of watching twin-boomed shadows diving from unreachable altitudes, the frustration of perfect deflection shots falling short because the Lightning was simply too fast to lead properly. The P-38 Lightning had not merely defeated Japanese air power. It revolutionized aerial combat itself. In skies above the Solomon Islands, between December 1942 and war's end, the future of air warfare was written. That future belonged not to the most maneuverable fighter or most skilled pilot, but to the nation that could produce superior technology, train effective pilots, and sustain prolonged campaigns. When modern F-22 Raptors employ supercruise to engage enemies beyond visual range, they're applying the P-38's lesson: control altitude and speed, strike from advantage. When Air Force doctrine emphasizes, first look, first shot, first kill, it echoes the Lightning's concentrated nose armament philosophy. When pilots train for energy management over turning dogfights, they're learning what Richard Bong mastered over the Solomons in 1942. The revolution continues. The fork-tailed devil's legacy endures in every jet fighter that controls the vertical battlefield, in every pilot who understands that altitude is life, speed is survival, and technological superiority properly employed transforms warfare itself. The twin-boomed fighter that Japanese pilots learned to fear had systematically eliminated their ability to contest control of Pacific skies, and in doing so, secured American air dominance that hastened the war's end.